The champagne flutes trembled in everyone's hands as Margaret Payton's voice cut through the elegant rehearsal dinner chatter like a knife through silk. "We're boycotting tomorrow's ceremony," she announced, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the microphone with white-knuckled determination. The string quartet stopped mid-note. Conversations died. Even the servers froze with their silver trays suspended in mid-air. Ava Payton felt her world tilt sideways as 200 pairs of eyes shifted between her mother and herself. This wasn't just any announcement. This was the detonation of a carefully constructed life that had taken 26 years to build. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days before that devastating moment, Ava Payton had been living what most people would consider a charmed life. At 26, she possessed the kind of effortless beauty that made strangers do double takes. Auburn hair that caught sunlight like spun copper, emerald eyes that sparkled with intelligence, and a smile that could disarm the most cynical critic. But it wasn't just her looks that made her magnetic. Ava had built something remarkable from nothing. Her boutique marketing firm, Payton Creative Solutions, occupied a converted warehouse in Portland's trendy Pearl district. What had started as a desperate attempt to pay rent after college had evolved into a thriving business that specialized in helping small, sustainable brands find their voice in an oversaturated market. Her team of 12 employees wasn't just staff, they were believers in her vision that marketing could be both profitable and purposeful. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew her story. Ava had grown up in Westbrook Heights, one of Portland's most exclusive neighborhoods, where her mother, Margaret, had reigned as the unofficial queen of high society. The Payton family name carried weight in circles that mattered: charity galas, country club committees, and the kind of networking events where million-dollar deals happened over martinis and air kisses. But Ava had rejected that world entirely. After graduating from Reed College with a degree in communications, she'd shocked her parents by turning down a prestigious position at her father's investment firm, Harrison & Associates. Instead, she'd rented a tiny studio apartment in Southeast Portland, lived off ramen noodles and determination, and built her business one client at a time. Her relationship with her parents had been strained ever since. Margaret Payton couldn't understand how her daughter preferred working with those hippie organic food companies over managing portfolios worth millions. Richard Payton, while secretly proud of Ava's entrepreneurial spirit, felt perpetually caught between supporting his daughter's independence and maintaining peace with his wife. The tension had reached a boiling point when Ava started dating Jackson Mitchell 2 years ago. Jackson was everything Margaret had nightmares about: a public school teacher from a middle-class family who drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic and thought a fancy dinner meant anything that required reservations. He taught 8th grade science at Roosevelt Middle School in North Portland, spent his summers volunteering at environmental camps, and never owned a suit that cost more than $200. But Jackson was also everything Ava had been searching for without realizing it. He was genuine in a world full of pretense, passionate about making a difference rather than making money, and possessed a quiet confidence that didn't need external validation. When he looked at her, he saw Ava the person, not Ava the Payton heiress or Ava the successful businesswoman. He saw her. Their love story had unfolded naturally, like morning glory vines climbing towards sunlight. They'd met at a farmer's market where Jackson was buying vegetables for a lesson about photosynthesis, and Ava was grabbing lunch between client meetings. He'd accidentally knocked over her iced coffee while reaching for heirloom tomatoes, and instead of the typical Portland passive-aggressive response, he'd laughed so genuinely at his own clumsiness that she found herself laughing too. Their first date had been a hike in Forest Park, followed by Thai food from a food cart and a late-night conversation on Powell Butte that lasted until sunrise.
No expensive restaurants, no orchestrated romance, just two people discovering they fit together like pieces of a puzzle they hadn't known they were solving. Margaret's disapproval had been immediate and unrelenting. She'd made snide comments about Jackson's quaint little job and questioned whether he was financially stable enough for someone of Ava's background. The fact that Jackson was genuinely happy in his career, that he'd turned down multiple offers to move into administration because he loved working directly with students, was incomprehensible to a woman who measured worth in stock options and social climbing. Richard had been more diplomatic, but equally concerned. During awkward family dinners, he'd pepper Jackson with questions about his long-term financial planning and suggest that perhaps he might consider pursuing a master's degree in educational leadership. Jackson would answer politely, but Ava could see the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his hand would find hers under the table for reassurance.
The engagement had happened on a Tuesday evening in March, in the most Jackson way possible. No flash mob, no jumbotron at a sporting event, no elaborate setup that would end up on social media. They'd been walking their rescue dog, Bandit, through Laurelhurst Park after dinner when Jackson suddenly stopped by the duck pond. "Ava," he'd said, his voice slightly shaky, "I know this isn't the most romantic spot, and I don't have a ring that costs more than your car payment, but..." He'd dropped to one knee right there on the gravel path, pulling out a vintage ring he'd found at an estate sale, a delicate Art Deco setting with a modest but beautiful diamond that had belonged to someone's grandmother decades ago. "Will you marry me not because we make sense on paper, but because we make sense in all the ways that actually matter?" Ava had said yes before he'd finished the question, tears streaming down her face as Bandit barked excitedly and a family of ducks paddled over to investigate the commotion. It was perfect because it was perfectly them. Unpretentious, genuine, and full of the kind of joy that couldn't be bought or staged. The wedding planning process had been a minefield of diplomatic negotiations. Margaret wanted the ceremony at the Columbia River Gorge Country Club with 300 guests, a 12-piece orchestra, and enough flowers to stock a small garden center. Ava wanted something smaller and more intimate, maybe 50 people at the Japanese garden, with a local folk band and wildflowers from the farmer's market. They'd compromised on Oswego Hills Vineyard, a beautiful venue that satisfied Margaret's need for elegance while honoring Ava and Jackson's desire for natural beauty. The guest list had been trimmed to 150, though Margaret had fought for every deletion like she was negotiating a peace treaty. The menu featured local, organic ingredients that Jackson had researched, prepared by a chef Margaret had grudgingly approved after tasting 3 different caterers. But beneath all the planning logistics, Ava could sense her mother's ongoing resistance to the marriage itself. Margaret had made several not-so-subtle suggestions about postponing the wedding until Jackson gets more established in his career. She'd forwarded articles about divorce rates among couples from different socioeconomic backgrounds. She'd even arranged for Ava to accidentally run into eligible bachelors from appropriate families at various social functions. Through it all, Jackson had remained remarkably patient and understanding. When Margaret made cutting remarks about his profession, he'd respond with genuine enthusiasm about his students' achievements. When she questioned his ability to provide for Ava financially, he'd calmly explain his pension plan and the house he'd been saving to buy. He never fought back, never got defensive, never gave Margaret the reaction she seemed to be seeking. "She'll come around," Ava would tell him after particularly tense family gatherings, "once she sees how happy we are together, once she gets to know the real you." But deep down, Ava had begun to worry that her mother's opposition ran deeper than simple social snobbery. There was something almost desperate about Margaret's attempts to derail the wedding, something that felt more like fear than mere disapproval. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be the moment when everyone finally came together, when the joy of the upcoming celebration would override any lingering tensions. Ava had spent extra time on her toast, crafting words that would acknowledge both families while celebrating the love that had brought everyone together. She'd even asked her mother to say a few words, hoping it would give her mother a chance to publicly embrace Jackson and welcome him into the family.
Standing in the elegant private dining room at Oswego Hills Vineyard, surrounded by the people who mattered most to her and Jackson, Ava had felt genuinely optimistic for the first time in months. The rehearsal ceremony had gone smoothly, with only minor confusion about processional timing. The dinner was delicious, the wine was flowing, and even Margaret seemed to be in good spirits, chatting animatedly with Jackson's parents about their recent trip to Costa Rica. But Ava should have recognized the signs. Her mother's laugh was slightly too loud, her gestures slightly too expansive. Margaret Payton was a woman who never did anything without careful calculation, and her sudden warmth towards Jackson's family should have been a warning rather than a relief. Instead, Ava had allowed herself to believe that everything was finally falling into place, that her wedding day would be the perfect celebration she'd dreamed of, that her two worlds were finally going to merge into one beautiful, complicated, loving family. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, her mother would detonate everything she had worked so hard to build, leaving Ava to pick up the pieces of not just her wedding plans, but her understanding of everything she thought she knew about her family, her past, and herself.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The silence that followed Margaret Payton's announcement stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Ava felt Jackson's hand find hers under the linen tablecloth, his palm warm but trembling slightly. Around them, the carefully orchestrated rehearsal dinner had transformed into something resembling a crime scene, with guests frozen in various states of shock and confusion. Margaret stood at the head table, still gripping the microphone, her usually perfect composure cracking around the edges. Her champagne-colored silk dress, which had cost more than most people's monthly rent, seemed to shimmer with an almost aggressive elegance against the vineyard's rustic backdrop. But it was her eyes that caught Ava's attention. There was something wild there, something desperate that Ava had never seen before. "Mom," Ava managed to whisper, her voice barely audible even to herself. She started to rise from her chair, but Margaret held up a perfectly manicured hand. "Please, everyone, sit down," Margaret continued, her voice now carrying the commanding tone she used at charity board meetings. "I know this comes as a shock, but there are things that need to be said, things that should have been said a long time ago." Richard Payton looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His face had gone completely pale, and he was staring at his wife with an expression of pure horror. "Margaret," he said, his voice tight with warning, "don't do this. Not here, not now." But Margaret seemed to be operating on a different frequency entirely. She set the microphone down on the table with deliberate care and walked around to face the assembled guests directly. Jackson's parents, David and Linda Mitchell, looked confused but concerned. Jackson's sister, Emma, was recording everything on her phone with the reflexive instinct of someone who'd grown up in the social media age. 27 years ago, Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly across the room without amplification, I made a decision that I thought was right, a decision that I convinced myself was best for everyone involved. Ava's stomach began to churn with a sickening dread. Whatever was coming, she knew instinctively that it would change everything. The way her mother was standing, the way her father was gripping his wine glass like it might anchor him to reality, this wasn't about wedding logistics or last-minute concerns about Jackson's suitability as a husband. "Ava," Margaret continued, turning to face her daughter directly, "there's something you need to know about your birth, something I should have told you years ago, but I was too proud, too afraid, too invested in maintaining the life we'd built." The room seemed to tilt sideways. Ava felt Jackson's grip on her hand tighten, felt the curious and horrified stares of every guest burning into her skin. Her birth? What could her mother possibly need to reveal about something that happened 26 years ago? "You were not born at Portland General Hospital on March 15th as your birth certificate states," Margaret said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "You were born 3 days earlier at a private clinic in Salem to a 16-year-old girl named Rebecca Torres." The words hit Ava like physical blows. 16-year-old girl, Rebecca Torres, not born at Portland General Hospital. The familiar foundations of her identity began crumbling beneath her feet. "Margaret, stop!" Richard's voice cracked like a whip across the room. He was standing now, his usually controlled demeanor completely shattered. "You're destroying everything. Think about what you're doing." But Margaret seemed to beyond rational thought. Tears were streaming down her face, cutting tracks through her expertly applied makeup. "I can't let her make the same mistake I did, Richard. I can't watch her throw away everything we've built for someone who will never understand what it means to be a Payton." Jackson's voice when he finally spoke was steady, despite the chaos swirling around them. "Mrs. Payton, I don't understand what you're trying to say. What does any of this have to do with our wedding?" Margaret laughed, but it was a broken sound, hollow and desperate. "Don't you see? She's not really my daughter. We bought her, Jackson. We paid Rebecca Torres $50,000 to disappear and let us raise Ava as our own. We forged documents, bribed officials, created an entire elaborate fiction because I couldn't carry a child to term and I was too proud to admit it." The revelation hit the room like an explosion. Gasps and murmurs erupted from every table. Someone's wine glass shattered against the floor. Emma Mitchell's phone clattered onto her plate as her hands began shaking too badly to hold it steady. But for Ava, the world had gone completely silent. She could see people's mouths moving, could see the shocked expressions and pointing fingers, but she couldn't hear anything over the roaring in her ears. Adopted. She was adopted. Everything she'd believed about herself, about her family, about her place in the world, all of it was built on a lie. The Payton name, the inheritance, the social connections, none of it rightfully belongs to her, and I'll be damned if I'm going to watch her give it all away to marry a middle school teacher who makes $35,000 a year.
That last comment seemed to snap Jackson out of his shocked silence. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that Ava had never heard before. "With all due respect, Mrs. Payton, even if everything you're saying is true, it doesn't change the fact that I love your daughter. It doesn't change the fact that she's built an incredible life for herself, that she's kind and brilliant and strong. And it sure as hell doesn't change the fact that she deserves better than having her entire world torn apart at her own rehearsal dinner." Margaret whirled on him with fury blazing in her eyes. "You don't understand what you're talking about, young man. Ava has responsibilities, obligations to the family that raised her. She can't just run off and play house with someone who will never be able to provide for her the way she deserves." "The way she deserves?" Jackson's composure finally cracked. "She deserves honesty, Mrs. Payton. She deserves parents who love her unconditionally, not people who see her as some kind of investment that needs to pay dividends." Richard had moved around the table and was now standing beside his wife, his face a mask of anguish and fury. "Margaret, you've said enough. More than enough. Look what you've done." He gestured toward Ava, who was still sitting in stunned silence, her face white as paper. But Margaret wasn't finished. If anything, the confrontation with Jackson seemed to fuel her determination. "There's more," she said, turning back to address the room. "Rebecca Torres, Ava's birth mother. She didn't just disappear. She's been in Portland this entire time. She works at Roosevelt Middle School." The words hit Jackson like a physical blow. His face went slack with shock, and he sank back into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. "That's right," Margaret continued with cruel satisfaction. "It's a guidance counselor at your school, Jackson. Has been for 8 years. Did you really think it was a coincidence that you ended up working at the same place? That you and Ava just happened to meet by chance at that farmer's market?" The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Jackson's face cycled through confusion, realization, and then something that looked like betrayal. He turned to look at Ava, his eyes searching her face for answers she didn't have. "I don't understand," he whispered. "Are you saying that Rebecca, Mrs. Torres, she knew who Ava was when we met?" Margaret's smile was sharp and vindictive. "I'm saying that maybe your fairy tale romance isn't quite as random as you thought. I'm saying that there are forces at work here that neither of you understood, and I'm saying that tomorrow's wedding is not going to happen because this family will not be party to a union built on lies and manipulation." Ava finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. Rebecca Torres? She's at Roosevelt? All this time? Jackson nodded numbly. She's been there since before I started. She actually helped me get the job, actually. Said she saw something in my interview that reminded her of... She stopped, his face going even paler as the pieces began to fall into place. Reminded her of what, Jackson? Ava asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Of someone she used to know, he finished quietly. Someone she cared about very much, but had to let go. Margaret clapped her hands together with mock delight. Isn't that touching? The guidance counselor who gave away her daughter orchestrating a reunion through her daughter's fiancé. It's like something out of a soap opera, isn't it? The room erupted in chaos as guests began talking all at once, some standing to leave, others pulling out phones to capture what was clearly going to be the scandal of the Portland social season. Jackson's parents looked bewildered and hurt, while several of Margaret's society friends were already whispering among themselves, no doubt calculating how this revelation would affect their own social standing. But Ava heard none of it. She was staring at her hands, at the engagement ring Jackson had chosen so carefully, trying to process the fact that everything she'd believed about her life had just been revealed to be an elaborate fiction. She wasn't Margaret and Richard's biological daughter. Her birth mother was alive and had been working in the same building as her fiancé for years. Her entire relationship with Jackson might have been orchestrated by people she'd never even known existed. The woman she'd called mother for 26 years had just blown up her entire world, and she'd done it in front of everyone who mattered to them. The wedding that was supposed to happen in 18 hours now seemed an impossibility, not because of logistics or planning, but because Ava no longer knew who she was or what she wanted or whom she could trust. As the chaos swirled around her, Ava made a decision that surprised even herself. She stood up slowly, removed her engagement ring, and placed it gently on the table in front of Jackson. I need some time, she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying over all the other noise in the room. I need to figure out who I am before I can promise to spend my life with anyone. And with that, she walked out of the rehearsal dinner, leaving behind not only her wedding plans, but everything she thought she knew about herself.
Ava's Honda Civic felt like a time machine as she drove through the empty Portland streets at nearly midnight, each familiar landmark now carrying the weight of questions she'd never thought to ask. The Pioneer Courthouse Square, where she'd had countless lunch meetings. The Willamette River bridges she'd crossed thousands of times. Even the street signs seemed to mock her with their permanence, while her entire sense of self had just been obliterated. She found herself pulling into the parking lot of Roosevelt Middle School without consciously deciding to go there. The building sat dark and imposing against the cloudy Oregon sky, its brick facade giving away nothing about the secrets it might hold. Somewhere inside that building was Rebecca Torres, the woman who had given birth to her, who had apparently been watching from the shadows for 8 years. The security lights cast long shadows across the empty playground as Ava sat in her car, engine running, trying to make sense of the impossible. Her phone had been buzzing constantly since she'd left the vineyard, Jackson calling, her father texting, even some of the wedding guests who'd somehow gotten her number sending messages of shock and support. But she'd turned the volume off after the 15th call, needing silence to process the earthquake that had just reshaped her world. A tap on her passenger window made her jump. Jackson stood there in his rehearsal dinner outfit, his tie loosened and hanging around his neck like a noose, his usually neat hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted, but when he met her gaze through the glass, she saw something that surprised her. Not anger or betrayal, but concern. She rolled down the window and he leaned down to speak to her. I figured I might find you here, he said softly. I've been driving around looking for you for 2 hours. How did you know? She asked, her voice hoarse from crying she didn't remember doing. Because I know you, he said simply, and because if I just found out my birth mother worked at my fiancé's school, I'd probably want to see the building too. The word fiancé hung between them, technically accurate but feeling strangely obsolete after everything that had happened. Ava looked down at her bare ring finger, already pale where the engagement ring had left its mark. "Can I get in?" Jackson asked. "Or do you need more time alone?" Ava unlocked the passenger door, and Jackson folded his long frame into the small car. For a moment, they sat in silence, both staring at the school building as if it might provide answers to questions they were still learning to ask. "I called the school directory," Jackson said eventually. "Rebecca Torres, guidance counselor, extension 247. She's been there since 2017. I started in 2019. He paused, running his hand through his hair again. "She recommended me for the position, Ava. She was on the hiring committee." Ava felt a fresh wave of disorientation wash over her. "So she knew. When she recommended you, she knew who you were going to meet." "Maybe," Jackson said carefully. "Or maybe she was just trying to help a good teacher find a job. I don't know what to think anymore." They sat with that uncertainty, watching a police car cruise slowly through the neighborhood on its routine patrol. Ava found herself wondering if Rebecca Torres lived nearby, if she drove past this school every day, knowing that her daughter was somewhere in the city, building a life that might intersect with hers. "I called off the wedding," Jackson said suddenly. Ava turned to look at him, surprised. "You did?" He nodded, staring straight ahead. "After you left, things got even worse. Your mother started telling anyone who would listen that the whole thing was a sham, that you'd been living a lie your whole life. Your father was shouting at her to stop. My parents were trying to help clean up the mess. Literally, someone knocked over the entire dessert table during the chaos." Despite everything, Ava felt a small smile tug at the corner of her mouth. "The dessert table?" "Emma was live streaming the whole thing on Instagram until my dad made her stop. By the time I left, there were already comments from people we'd never met asking if this was some kind of publicity stunt." Jackson's voice carried a mix of exhaustion and bitter amusement. "I canceled the venue, the caterer, the flowers, the photographer, everyone. Told them it was a family emergency." "What about the deposits?" Jackson shrugged. "Your father said he'd handle the financial stuff. I think he feels guilty about what happened." "Actually, I think he's as shocked as we are. The way he was looking at your mother, I don't think he knew she was going to do that." I had been wondering about that. Her father's reaction had seemed genuinely horrified, not like someone who'd been complicit in the plan to sabotage the wedding. But then again, she'd been wrong about so many things that she wasn't sure she could trust her judgment about anything. "I need to talk to her," Ava said suddenly. "Your mother?" "Rebecca Torres, She struggled with the words. "My birth mother. I need to understand what actually happened, what she knows, why she's been at your school all this time." Jackson was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sure you're ready for that? It's been less than 4 hours since you found out she existed." "I don't think I'll ever be ready," Ava admitted. "But I can't move forward with anything until I know the truth about why she gave me up, about whether our meeting was really a coincidence, about what she's been thinking all these years." "Okay," Jackson said, and you could hear the decision forming in his voice. "Then let's find her." "Now? It's almost 1 a.m. I know where she lives." "How did you possibly know that?" "Faculty directory. We all have each other's emergency contact information." And he looked embarrassed. "I may have looked her up after your mother's revelation. I needed to know if this was real or if your mother was having some kind of breakdown."
And? Rebecca Torres, age 42, lives at 847 Hawthorne Boulevard, apartment 3B. She's worked as a guidance counselor for 12 years, first at Wilson High School, then at Roosevelt. She has a master's degree in counseling psychology from Portland State. No husband listed, no other children in the school system. The clinical recitation of facts felt surreal. This woman, this stranger, who was somehow the most important person Ava had never met, had been living her own life just miles away, helping other people's children navigate their problems while her own daughter grew up not knowing she existed.
847 Hawthorne, Ava repeated. That's in the Richmond district. About 15 minutes from here. Ava started the car without another word, and Jackson buckled his seatbelt without questioning her decision. They drove through the quiet streets in silence, both lost in their own thoughts about what they might find and what they might say. Hawthorne Boulevard at 1 a.m. was a ghost town of closed cafes and empty boutiques. The apartment building at 847 was a converted Victorian house, painted sage green with white trim, divided into 6 units. Light showed in one third-floor window, and Ava found herself wondering if that was apartment 3B, if Rebecca Torres was awake too, perhaps unable to sleep after whatever conversation she might have had with Margaret Payton. "We don't have to do this tonight," Jackson said as Ava parked across the street from the building. "Yes, we do," Ava replied, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "If I wait, I'll lose my nerve. If I wait, I'll start second-guessing everything and talking myself out of it." They got out of the car and crossed the empty street. The building had an old-fashioned intercom system with apartment numbers and last names listed on small white labels. R. Torres, 3B, was written in careful block letters. Ava stood in front of the intercom for a full minute before pressing the button. The buzzing sound seemed incredibly loud in the quiet night, then silence. She was about to press it again when a voice came through the speaker, cautious, slightly groggy, but unmistakably female. "Hello? Rebecca Torres?" Ava's voice cracked on the name. A longer pause, then very quietly, "Yes. This is Ava Payton. I think we need to talk." The silence stretched so long that Ava wondered if the connection had been lost. Then the building's front door buzzed open with a harsh electronic sound. "Third floor," Rebecca's voice said through the intercom. "I'll leave the apartment door open." Ava and Jackson climbed the narrow staircase, their footsteps echoing in the small building. The third floor had 2 apartments, and the door to 3B stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the hallway. Ava paused before knocking, her hand raised to announce their presence. This was it, the moment that would either provide answers or create more questions. The conversation that might help her understand who she really was, or leave her more confused than ever. "Whatever happens," Jackson said softly behind her, "I'm here." Ava knocked gently on the open door. "Rebecca, it's Ava." "Come in," came the reply from inside the apartment. Ava pushed the door open and stepped inside, with Jackson close behind her. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with bookshelves and plants, the walls covered with artwork that looked like it had been made by children. And there, standing in the middle of the living room in pajamas and a robe bath, was a woman who looked exactly like Ava might in 20 years. Rebecca Torres had the same auburn hair, now streaked with silver, the same green eyes, the same delicate bone structure. But where Ava's face was smooth and young, Rebecca's carried lines of experience and what looked like decades of carefully controlled sadness. They stared at each other for a long moment, taking in the undeniable proof of their connection. Finally, Rebecca spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wondered if this day would ever come. I hoped it would, but I never imagined it would happen like this."
Rebecca Torres moved with the careful grace of someone who had spent years learning to contain her emotions. She gestured toward a worn leather couch adorned with hand-knitted throws, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the obvious shock of seeing Ava standing in her living room at 1 a.m. "Please, sit," Rebecca said, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "I'll make coffee or tea. I have herbal tea if you prefer." She was rambling, filling the silence with mundane offers that seemed absurd given the magnitude of the moment. "Ava," said gently, and the older woman stopped mid-sentence. "Just sit, please. We need to talk." Rebecca nodded and settled into an armchair across from the couch, pulling her bathrobe tighter around herself. In the warm lamplight, the resemblance between them was even more striking. Not just physical features, but something in the way they both held tension in their shoulders, the way their hands moved when they were nervous. "I should explain about Jackson's job," Rebecca began without preamble. "I know what Margaret told you, but it wasn't what she made it sound like." Jackson leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Torres, I don't understand how any of this is connected. I applied for the Roosevelt position through the district website. I never even met you until after I was hired." Rebecca's laugh was soft and sad. "That's not entirely true, Jackson. We met once before, very briefly. You probably don't remember. It was at a district training workshop about 3 years ago. You were presenting a program you developed for teaching environmental science through hands-on projects." Ava watched Jackson's face as he searched his memory. "The sustainability workshop at Lincoln High?" "Yes." Rebecca's hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "You talked about how you'd gotten your students to build raised garden beds and how their test scores had improved when they could see the real-world applications of what they were learning. It was brilliant, and you reminded me so much of someone I used to know." "My father," Ava said quietly, though she wasn't sure how she knew. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "Eduardo Ramirez. He was 17 when I was 16. He loved science, loved the environment, wanted to change the world through education. He had the same passion Jackson showed that day, the same way of making complex ideas accessible to young minds." The name hit Ava like a physical blow. Eduardo Ramirez. Her biological father had a name, had been a real person with dreams and ambitions. What happened to him? "His family was undocumented," Rebecca said simply. "They were deported when I was 7 months pregnant. One day he was there, planning our future and picking out baby names, and the next day he was gone. Just gone." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an old clock on the mantelpiece. Ava tried to process this new information. She wasn't just adopted, she was the daughter of a teenage couple torn apart by immigration enforcement. The story was becoming more complex and heartbreaking with every revelation. "So, when Jackson applied to Roosevelt," Jackson prompted gently, "when I saw his resume, his philosophy of education, his approach to teaching, it was like seeing Eduardo again," Rebecca admitted. "I advocated for him during the hiring process, yes, but not because I had some grand plan to orchestrate a meeting with my daughter. I genuinely believed he'd be good for our students." "But you knew who I was," Ava said. "You must have known when you saw my name in the news, when my business started getting media attention." Rebecca nodded slowly. "Ava Payton, successful entrepreneur, changing the marketing world one sustainable brand at a time. I followed your career from a distance. I was so proud of what you had accomplished, but I never intended to interfere. The adoption agreement I signed was very clear. I gave up all rights to contact you or be part of your life. But then Jackson and I met, and when he started talking about this amazing woman he had fallen in love with, when he showed me pictures and told me her name, I realized that maybe the universe was trying to give us all a second chance." Jackson was staring at Rebecca with a mixture of understanding and something that looked like betrayal. "You could have told me. When I started talking about Ava, you could have explained who she was." "And say what?" Rebecca's voice rose slightly, showing the first crack in her composed facade. "Hello, Jackson. The woman you're dating is actually my daughter, who was sold to a wealthy family when she was 3 days old? That would have gone over well?" "It would have been honest," Jackson replied firmly. "Honest." Rebecca repeated the word like it tasted bitter. "Honest is being 16 years old and pregnant with no money, no support, and no way to provide for a baby. Honest is watching the boy you love get dragged away by immigration officers while you're carrying his child. Honest is signing papers that let strangers raise your daughter because you know they can give you opportunities you never could." Ava felt tears streaming down her face as she began to understand the impossible situation Rebecca had faced. "You were just a kid yourself." "I was 17 when you were born," Rebecca continued, her voice breaking. 17, alone and terrified. Margaret and Richard Payton seemed like angels when they appeared with their lawyer and their promises. They said you'd have the best education, the best opportunities, that you'd never want for anything. But they lied to me. They never told me I was adopted. That wasn't supposed to happen." Rebecca's anger was finally showing through.
The agreement was that they would tell you about your adoption when you were old enough to understand, that they would paint it as a loving choice made by a young mother who wanted the best for you. Instead, they created an elaborate fiction and erased me completely from your history.
Jackson had been quiet through this exchange, but now he spoke up. Mrs. Torres, why didn't you ever try to contact Ava directly? Once she was an adult, the adoption agreement wouldn't have prevented you from reaching out. Rebecca looked at him with surprise, as if the question had never occurred to her. Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid she'd hate me for giving her up. Afraid she'd think I abandoned her. Afraid that Margaret and Richard had turned her against the idea of her birth parents. And honestly, afraid that I'd disrupt the life she'd built. But you were watching, Ava said. Following my career, staying informed about my life? From a distance, yes. I knew about your business, your success. I read every article about Payton Creative Solutions, watched every interview you gave. I was so proud of the woman you'd become, but I also saw how driven you were, how focused on proving yourself. I thought maybe having me in your life would complicate that. Ava stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street below. The weight of all these revelations was crushing. Not just the adoption, but the deportation of her biological father, the poverty and desperation that had led to her birth mother's impossible choice, the years of watching from the shadows. What was his name? She asked without turning around. My father, what was his full name? Eduardo Ramirez Mendoza, Rebecca said softly. He wanted to be a marine biologist. He used to say he was going to save the oceans, one classroom at a time. Jackson made a small sound of recognition. That's exactly what I tell my students, about saving the environment one classroom at a time. I know, Rebecca said simply. That's why I knew you were meant to be together, even before I understood the full connection. Ava turned back to face them, her mind racing. Do you know what happened to him, to Eduardo? Is he alive, as far as I know? Rebecca said. He's a professor now at the Universidad Nacional in Costa Rica. He has a family, a wife, 2 children. He's built a good life. Does he know about me? Rebecca shook her head. I never told him I was pregnant. When his family was deported, everything happened so fast. I thought about trying to contact him later, but by then you were gone, and I was trying to rebuild my own life. I decided it was better to let him move on without knowing what he'd lost. The room fell silent again, as they all absorbed the implications of this. Somewhere in Costa Rica was a man who had no idea he had a daughter, who had been forced to leave behind not just a girlfriend, but an unborn child he'd never had the chance to know existed. I want to find him, Ava said suddenly, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. I want to meet my biological father. Ava, Jackson said carefully, are you sure? That's a huge step, and you're dealing with so much already. I'm sure, she said, turning to look at Rebecca. I need to understand where I came from, who I really am. Margaret's revelation didn't just destroy my wedding. It destroyed my sense of identity. I can't figure out who I want to be until I know who I actually am. Rebecca was studying Ava's face with an expression of hope mixed with fear. If you're serious about this, I can help. I've kept track of Eduardo over the years, not obsessively, but I've wondered about him, about what our lives might have been like if things had been different. What are you thinking? Jackson asked Ava. Ava took a deep breath, feeling something shift inside her, a sense of purpose emerging from the chaos of the past few hours. I'm thinking we go to Costa Rica, all of us. I want to meet my biological father, and I want him to meet the man I was supposed to marry before my world exploded. Supposed to marry? Jackson's voice was very quiet. Ava crossed the room and knelt in front of his chair, taking his hands in hers. Jackson, I took off my ring tonight because I was scared and confused, and I didn't know what was real anymore. But sitting here, listening to Rebecca's story, understanding what my parents went through, I realized that love doesn't become less real because it's complicated. If anything, it becomes more precious. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the engagement ring she'd removed at the rehearsal dinner. I want to marry you, Jackson Mitchell, not because it's convenient or expected or part of some grand plan, but because you're the person who drove around Portland for 2 hours looking for me when my world fell apart. Because you're sitting here at 2 a.m. helping me find answers instead of running away from the mess my family created. Jackson's eyes filled with tears as she slipped the ring back onto her finger. "Are you proposing to me?" she said with the first genuine smile she'd felt in hours. "I'm re-accepting your proposal, with full knowledge of who I really am and what we're both choosing to commit to." Rebecca was crying openly now. "This isn't how I imagined this conversation would go." "Nothing about this situation is normal," Ava said, standing and helping Jackson to his feet. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe normal is overrated." Jackson pulled her into his arms, and for the first time since Margaret's announcement, Ava felt grounded. Whatever challenges lay ahead, meeting her biological father, dealing with the aftermath of the canceled wedding, rebuilding relationships with the people who had raised her, she wouldn't face them alone. "So," she said, looking at Rebecca, "how do we get to Costa Rica?"
The next morning brought the harsh reality of what traveling to Costa Rica would actually entail. Ava sat at Rebecca's kitchen table, surrounded by printed emails, passport documents, and the remnants of what should have been her wedding day breakfast, trying to coordinate an international trip that had seemed so simple at 2 a.m. "The earliest flight we can get is Thursday," Jackson said, hanging up his phone after the 5th call to different airlines. "And that's if we're willing to pay double the normal fare and make 2 connections." Rebecca looked up from her laptop, where she'd been researching Eduardo's current position at the Universidad Nacional. "I found his faculty page. He's not just a professor, he's the department head of marine sciences. He's published over 40 papers on coral reef restoration." She paused, studying the screen. He looks exactly like I remember, just older." Ava leaned over to see the photo. A distinguished man in his 40s with kind eyes and graying hair, standing next to what appeared to be a research vessel. The resemblance was there, if you looked for it, but subtle. She had Eduardo's jawline and the shape of his eyes, but Rebecca's coloring and delicate features. "There's another problem," Ava said, scrolling through her own phone. "My business. I have 3 major client presentations this week, including the Morrison Foods account that we've been working on for 6 months. If I disappear to Costa Rica without notice, I could lose contracts worth over $200,000. The weight of her professional responsibilities had hit her like a freight train when she'd woken up in Rebecca's spare bedroom that morning. Payton Creative Solutions wasn't just her livelihood. It employed 12 people who depended on her leadership and the steady stream of clients she'd spent years cultivating. "Can't your team handle things while you're gone?" Jackson asked. "For a normal vacation, yes, but this isn't a normal situation." Ava rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. "Sarah Martinez, my operations manager, is brilliant, but she's not equipped to make executive-level decisions about new business partnerships. And if clients start asking questions about where I am?" The unspoken concern hung in the air. News of the canceled wedding and Margaret's explosive revelations had already started spreading through the Portland business community. Ava's phone had been buzzing with messages from colleagues, clients, and even some random blogger who claims he has exclusive details about her family situation. "Have you seen this?" Rebecca asked quietly, turning her laptop screen toward them. She had navigated to a local society blog called Portland Pearls, which featured a headline that made Ava's stomach drop. "Wedding drama rocks elite family. Adoption secrets exposed at Vineyard rehearsal dinner." The article was accompanied by several photos that had clearly been taken by guests at the rehearsal dinner, including one of Margaret at the microphone and another of Ava walking out with her engagement ring in her hand.
The writer had somehow obtained detailed information about the adoption revelation and was speculating wildly about the mysterious circumstances surrounding Ava's birth. "This is a disaster," Ava said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My clients are going to see this, my employees, everyone in the Portland business community is going to know that my entire identity was a lie." Jackson reached across the table to take her hand. "Your identity wasn't a lie, Ava. You built your business. You created those relationships. You earned that success. None of that changes because of who your biological parents are." But Ava was already spiraling into worst-case scenarios. The Morrison Foods contract specifically includes a morality clause. They're a family-owned company that prides itself on traditional values. If they think I'm some kind of fraud... Her phone rang, interrupting her panic. The caller ID showed Sarah Martinez's number, and Ava's heart sank. She answered on the third ring, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sarah, I know this is early, but..." "Ava, thank God you answered." Sarah's usually calm voice was tight with stress. "I've been getting calls since 7 a.m. Reporters, clients, even some random blogger who claims he has exclusive details about your family situation. What the hell happened last night?" Ava closed her eyes, leaning back in the kitchen chair. "It's complicated. Very complicated. I need you to handle things at the office for a few days while I sort some things out." "A few days?" Sarah's voice rose an octave. "Ava, the Morrison presentation is Wednesday. The Greenfield campaign launch is Friday. You have a board meeting with the Pacific Northwest Sustainability Initiative on Thursday. I can't just..." I know it's a lot to ask, but some things come up that I have to deal with personally." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Does this have to do with whatever happened at your rehearsal dinner? Because Marcus from Morrison Foods called this morning asking if the recent publicity was going to affect our partnership." Ava felt like she was drowning. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, was being threatened by the revelation of secrets she'd never even known existed. "What did you tell him?" "That I'd have you call him back today. But Ava, I need to know what's going on. If there's going to be ongoing media attention, if there are legal issues, if this is going to affect the business, I need to know so I can manage the situation." Rebecca had been listening to the conversation with growing concern. Now she leaned forward and whispered, "Tell her the truth. She deserves to know." Ava looked at Jackson, who nodded encouragingly. Taking a deep breath, she made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating.
"Sarah, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this conversation until I figure out how to handle it publicly. Last night, I found out that I was adopted. My parents never told me, and my biological mother has been in Portland this entire time. I'm dealing with some major family issues that require immediate attention." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Ava wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice gentle but practical. "Okay, that's huge, Ava. I'm so sorry you're going through this." Another pause. "But from a business standpoint, we need a plan. Can you handle the Morrison presentation remotely? Can we reschedule some of the less critical meetings?" Relief flooded through Ava. Sarah wasn't abandoning ship or panicking. She was problem-solving, which was exactly what Ava needed. "I might have to travel out of the country for a few days, family situation, but yes, I can do Morrison remotely if we set up a video conference." "Out of the country?" Sarah's surprise was evident. "Ava, are you sure this is the right time to..." "I have to," Ava said firmly. "There are things I need to understand about my family, about where I came from. I can't move forward with my life until I have those answers." Jackson was watching her with pride as she took control of the situation. Rebecca had pulled out a notebook and was writing what looked like a list of practical considerations. "All right," Sarah said finally. "Here's what we're going to do. I'll reschedule everything non-essential for next week. Morrison can be handled via video conference on Wednesday. I'll set that up. The Greenleaf launch, that's trickier, but maybe we can delegate the presentation to Marcus if you brief him thoroughly beforehand." "You're amazing," Ava said, feeling the first spark of hope she had all morning.
I'm practical, Sarah corrected, and I believe in this company. We'll figure it out. But Ava, whatever you're dealing with, whatever you find out about your family, don't let it change how you see yourself or what you've accomplished. You built this business from nothing. That's not something that can be taken away by other people's secrets. After hanging up, Ava felt like she could finally breathe properly for the first time in hours. The business challenges were manageable, at least temporarily, but as she looked at Rebecca's growing list of travel preparations, she realized they were facing an even bigger obstacle. "Rebecca," she said slowly, "have you thought about what this trip might do to your job? You can't just disappear to Costa Rica without notice any more than I can." Rebecca's pen stopped moving across the notebook. I hadn't thought about that part. How long have you been at Roosevelt?" 8 years. I've never taken an unscheduled absence, never called in sick with legitimate cause. The guidance counseling department is short-staffed as it is. Jackson was looking between them with growing concern. "And it's not like you can tell them you're traveling to Costa Rica to help your daughter meet the father she's never known. That would raise questions you're probably not ready to answer publicly." The practical complications were multiplying faster than they could solve them. Ava's business needed her attention, Rebecca's job required her presence, and Jackson had his own classes to consider. The school year was in full swing, and middle school science teachers couldn't simply vanish without disrupting their students' education. "Maybe we're being impulsive," Ava said reluctantly. "Maybe we should wait until summer break or until I can properly prepare my business for my absence." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. The momentum of discovery that had carried her through the night was already starting to fade in the harsh light of practical reality. If they waited, if they let the everyday concerns of work and responsibility take precedence, she might never find the courage to take the step. Rebecca seemed to be thinking the same thing. "No," she said firmly. "We can't wait. 26 years is long enough. Eduardo deserves to know he has a daughter, and you deserve to know your father. But the logistics—" "We'll figure out the logistics," Rebecca interrupted. "I'll take emergency family leave. I have sick days saved up, and if necessary, I'll take unpaid leave. You've managed to build a successful business while handling everything else life has thrown at you. You can manage a few days of remote work." Jackson nodded slowly. "And I can arrange for a substitute teacher. The district has protocols for family emergencies." Ava looked at them both, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. These were the people who had chosen to stand with her when her world collapsed, her biological mother who had spent years watching from the shadows, and the man she loved who had supported her through the most difficult night of her life. "Okay," she said, feeling the decision settle into her bones. "Let's do this. Let's go find my father." But even as they began making concrete plans, flight bookings, hotel reservations, work arrangements, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that they were embarking on something that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Finding Eduardo was just the beginning. The real challenge would be figuring out how to integrate this new knowledge into the lives they'd already built, and whether the relationships that had brought them this far would be strong enough to survive whatever truths they might uncover in Costa Rica.
The San Jose airport in Costa Rica was a chaos of humidity, unfamiliar Spanish announcements, and the overwhelming realization that they had just made a monumentally impulsive decision. After 27 hours of travel, including a missed connection in Miami that had forced them to spend an unplanned night in an airport hotel, Ava felt like she was moving through a dream where nothing quite made sense. Jackson was struggling with a Spanish phrase book, trying to communicate with a taxi driver about their hotel, while Rebecca stood frozen in the arrivals area, staring at her phone with an expression of growing horror. "What is it?" Ava asked, though she suspected she didn't want to know the answer. Rebecca held up her phone, showing a string of missed calls and text messages. 37 missed calls from my principal, 14 voicemails. The school district's emergency contact system has been trying to reach me since yesterday. Ava's stomach dropped.
In all their planning and preparation, they had somehow failed to account for the fact that Rebecca's sudden disappearance would trigger the school's emergency protocols. Teachers and staff weren't supposed to simply vanish without explanation, especially guidance counselors who had active cases involving troubled students. "What do the messages say?" Jackson asked, abandoning his conversation with the taxi driver. Rebecca's face was pale as she scrolled through the texts. "There was an incident yesterday. One of my students, Maria Santos, she's been struggling with depression and family issues. She specifically asked for me on Tuesday, and when I wasn't there..." Rebecca's voice trailed off as she read the most recent message. "Rebecca, what happened?" "She tried to hurt herself," Rebecca said quietly. "She's okay. She's in the hospital, but she's been asking for me specifically. The principal wants to know where I am and why I'm not answering my phone." The weight of Rebecca's professional responsibilities crashed down on them all. This wasn't just about paperwork or missed meetings. There was a 15-year-old girl in a Portland hospital who had been counting on Rebecca's support. And instead of being there, Rebecca was standing in a Costa Rican airport chasing answers to questions that had waited 26 years. "We have to go back," Rebecca said, already looking around for signs directing them to departure gates. "I have to go back right now." "Wait," Ava said, though part of her agreed completely. "Let's think about this rationally. Is there anything you can do from here? Can you call the hospital, talk to Maria, coordinate with other counselors?" Rebecca was already dialing. "I'm calling the hospital first, then the school." She walked a few steps away, pressing the phone to her ear with shaking hands. Jackson pulled Ava aside, his voice low. "She's right, she needs to go back. That girl is her responsibility, and if something happens..." "I know," Ava said miserably, "but Jackson, we're here. We're actually here. Eduardo is probably less than 2 hours away, and if Rebecca leaves now, I might never get another chance like this." "There will be other chances." "Will there? You saw how hard it was just to coordinate this trip. Rebecca's job, my business, your classes. When will we ever be able to do this again? And what if Eduardo travels? Or what if something happens to him? Or what if he just decides he doesn't want to meet me?" Jackson studied her face, seeing the desperation she was trying to hide. "This isn't just about meeting your father, is it? This is about proving to yourself that you're not going to let other people's secrets control your life anymore." Before Ava could answer, Rebecca returned, her face streaked with tears. "Maria is stable, but she's refusing to talk to anyone except me. The hospital psychiatrist says she's been asking for Mrs. Torres repeatedly, and they think my presence could be crucial for her recovery." "Then you have to go," Ava said, though the words felt like glass in her throat. "I can't leave you here alone." "She won't be alone," Jackson said firmly. "I'll stay with her. We'll find Eduardo together, and when we get back to Portland, we'll all meet properly." Rebecca shook her head. "You don't understand. Eduardo doesn't know you're coming. He doesn't even know Ava exists. I can't just abandon you to have that conversation by yourselves." "Then we call him," Ava said, surprising herself with the suggestion. "Right now. We call Eduardo and explain who we are and why we're here. If he agrees to meet us, you can go back to Portland knowing we're not walking into this blindly." Rebecca stared at her. "You want to call him? Just call him and tell him he has a daughter? What's the alternative? We all go back to Portland, Maria gets the help she needs, and I spend the rest of my life wondering about the father I never met? Or we wait another 6 months and try to plan this again, assuming we can ever coordinate our schedules." Jackson was nodding slowly. "It's not ideal, but it's honest. And Eduardo deserves honesty more than he deserves a perfectly orchestrated surprise." Rebecca pulled up Eduardo's faculty page on her phone, staring at his contact information. "His office number is listed here. She checked the time. It's almost 2 p.m. here, so he'd be in his office hours." "Are you going to call him?" Ava asked. "We're going to call him," Rebecca corrected. "Together." They found a quiet corner of the airport, away from the constant stream of travelers and announcements. Rebecca dialed the international number with trembling fingers and put the phone on speaker. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and Ava began to think they might get voicemail instead of the man himself. Then a voice answered in accented English. Universidad Nacional, Marine Sciences Department, Professor Ramirez speaking.
Rebecca's hand flew to her mouth, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The voice was older, more mature, but unmistakably the same one she remembered from 27 years ago. "Hello?" Eduardo said again. "Is someone there?" "Eduardo," Rebecca finally managed. This is Rebecca Torres. I don't know if you remember me, but we knew each other a long time ago, in Portland." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Ava wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Eduardo spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca Torres from Portland. But that was so many years ago. How did you find me? Why are you calling?" "Eduardo, I need to tell you something that I should have told you 27 years ago. When your family was deported, when you had to leave so suddenly, I was pregnant." Another long silence. Then Eduardo said something in rapid Spanish that sounded like a prayer or perhaps a curse. "Eduardo, are you still there?" "I'm here," but his voice sounded strained. "Rebecca, are you telling me that you had a child?" "A daughter. Her name is Ava, and she's 26 years old, and she's here, in Costa Rica. She wants to meet you." "She's here? Now?" Ava leaned closer to the phone. "Professor Ramirez, this is Ava. I know this is an incredible shock, and I'm sorry we couldn't find a better way to tell you, but—" "My God," Eduardo interrupted. You sound just like your mother did when she was young." Tears were streaming down Ava's face now. "I'd like to meet you, if you're willing. I know it's complicated, and I know you have your own family now, but I've just learned about you, and I need to understand where I came from." "Your own family?" Rebecca asked quietly. Eduardo's voice became careful, formal. "Yes, I am married. I have 2 children. My wife, Carmen. She knows about you, Rebecca, about our relationship in Portland, but she doesn't know about me," Ava finished. "I never knew," Eduardo said, his voice breaking. "Rebecca, you have to believe me. I never knew you were pregnant. If I had known, I would have found a way to stay, or to bring you with us, or—" "I know," Rebecca said softly. "There wasn't time to tell you, and then you were gone, and I thought it was better to let you build a new life without the burden of knowing what you'd left behind." "Burden?" Eduardo's voice rose. "She would never have been a burden. A child! Our child! God, Rebecca, do you have any idea what it would have meant to know I had a daughter? Even if I couldn't be with her, to know she existed?" The pain in his voice was devastating. Ava realized that Rebecca's choice to protect him had caused its own kind of suffering. The suffering of not knowing, of missing 26 years of his daughter's life. "Professor Ramirez, I understand if this is too much. If the timing is wrong, if you need time to think about whether you want to meet me." No, Ava. I want to meet you more than I've ever wanted anything in my life. But I need to talk to Carmen first. I need to explain to my children that they have a sister they've never known about. This is going to change everything for my family." Rebecca closed her eyes. "Eduardo, I have to fly back to Portland tonight. There's an emergency at work that I have to handle, but Ava and her fiancé Jackson are here, and they can stay if you're willing to meet with them." "Her fiancé?" Jackson spoke up. "Sir, I'm Jackson Mitchell. I teach middle school science, and I love your daughter very much. I'm here to support her through this, whatever you decide." "A science teacher," Eduardo said, and I could hear something like wonder in his voice. "Like I always wanted to be." "You are a science teacher. You are a professor. You are published. You're the department head. You became exactly what you wanted to be. But I missed watching you become who you are. I missed everything." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Eduardo asking questions about Ava's life, her business, her relationship with Jackson. Rebecca provided details about the adoption, about Margaret and Richard Payton, and about the circumstances that had led them to making this trip. By the end of the call, they had made tentative plans for Eduardo and Ava to meet the following afternoon, after he had time to prepare his family for the revelation. Rebecca would fly back to Portland that evening to help Maria Santos, and Ava and Jackson would spend 3 days in Costa Rica, getting to know the father they'd never known they had. As they said goodbye and hung up, Rebecca looked exhausted and conflicted. "I'm sorry," she told Ava. "I'm sorry I have to leave you here for this." "You're doing the right thing," Ava assured her. "Maria needs you, and I think I need to do this part on my own anyway." "Well, not alone," she added, taking Jackson's hand, "but without feeling like I'm responsible for managing everyone else's emotions." But as they watched Rebecca's flight take off 3 hours later, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that she was more alone than she'd been since this journey began. Tomorrow she would meet her biological father for the first time, in a country where she didn't speak the language, without the woman who had connected them. The setback felt enormous, and she wondered if they had made a terrible mistake in coming so far from home to chase answers that might be too painful to bear.
The Café Brit, overlooking the Central Valley of Costa Rica, was nothing like the sterile meeting rooms where Ava usually conducted important business. Eduardo had suggested they meet here instead of his university office, saying he wanted their first conversation to happen somewhere beautiful, somewhere that felt like a beginning rather than an ending. Ava arrived 30 minutes early, her nervous energy making it impossible to stay in the hotel room any longer. Jackson had offered to come with her, but she'd asked him to wait nearby instead. This first meeting needed to be just between her and Eduardo, without the complexity of additional relationships and explanations. She ordered a cortado and sat at a table overlooking the mountains, trying to calm her racing heart. Every middle-aged man who entered the cafe made her pulse spike, wondering if this was him, if this was the moment she would finally look into the eyes of her biological father. When Eduardo finally arrived, there was no mistaking him. The faculty photo hadn't captured his presence, the way he moved with quiet confidence, the intelligence in his dark eyes, the gentle strength that seemed to radiate from him like warmth. He was wearing a simple blue button-down shirt and khakis, and he paused in the doorway to scan the cafe until his gaze landed on her. The recognition was instant and mutual. Eduardo's face transformed with wonder and something that looked like profound grief, while Ava felt a strange sense of coming home to a place she'd never been before. He approached her table slowly, as if sudden movements might make her disappear. "Ava?" "Eduardo." She stood up, uncertain whether to hug him or shake his hand, or simply stand there absorbing the reality of his presence. He solved the dilemma by opening his arms, and she stepped into them tentatively. The embrace was careful, respectful, but she could feel him trembling slightly. When they separated, both of their eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You're so beautiful," he said softly. "You look like your mother, but you have my sister's eyes. My sister Rosa, she would have loved you so much." They sat down across from each other, and Eduardo ordered coffee with the easy Spanish that reminded Ava how foreign this world was to her. She had inherited half her genetic makeup from this man, but she couldn't speak his native language, had never experienced his culture, knew nothing about the family she might have had if history had unfolded differently. "I brought something," Eduardo said, pulling a worn leather photo album from his messenger bag.
Pictures of our family in Mexico before we came to Portland. I thought you might want to know about your grandparents, your aunts and uncles." As he opened the album, Ava saw faces that carried echoes of her own features. A grandmother with the same delicate bone structure, an uncle with her exact eyebrow shape, cousins who shared her smile. These were people who had lived and died without knowing she existed. Family connections that had been severed before she'd even been born. "This is your grandmother, Elena," Eduardo said, pointing to a photo of a small woman in a flowered dress standing in front of a modest house. "She taught me to love the ocean. She used to say that water connects all living things, that if you understood the ocean, you could understand the world." "Is that why you became a marine biologist?" "Partly." Eduardo's finger traced the edge of the photograph. "But mostly because I wanted to honor the promise I made to you before you were born." Ava looked up sharply. "Promise?" Eduardo's smile was sad and proud at the same time. "When Rebecca was pregnant, when we were making plans for our life together, I used to talk to you every night. I would put my hand on her belly and tell you about the oceans, about the coral reefs, about how I was going to teach you to protect the planet we were bringing you into." "You talked to me?" "Every single night for the 7 months I was there. I told you about the kelp forests off the Oregon coast, about the salmon runs, about how the health of the ocean reflected the health of the world. I promised you that I would spend my life learning how to heal damaged ecosystems so that your generation would inherit something better than what we were leaving behind. I've always been drawn to environmental causes. My business specializes in sustainable brands, and I've never really known why that mattered so much to me. Maybe because some promises transcend physical presence," Eduardo said gently. "Maybe because love finds ways to travel across time and distance." He turned the page to show her more recent photos. His wife Carmen, a kind-faced woman with laugh lines around her eyes, and 2 children, a boy of about 12 and a girl of 14. "These are your half-siblings," Eduardo said carefully. "Miguel and Sofia. They don't know about you yet, but Carmen does now. I told her last night." "How did she take it?" Eduardo's expression became complicated. "She's a remarkable woman, very understanding, but she's also protective of our children, concerned about how this revelation might affect them. She asked if you were planning to stay in Costa Rica, if you wanted to become part of our daily lives." "And what did you tell her?" "That I didn't know what you wanted, but that regardless, you're my daughter and you'll always be welcome in our home." The simple statement broke something open in Ava's chest. After 26 years of believing she was Margaret and Richard's biological child, after the devastating revelation that her entire identity had been built on lies and legal documents, here was someone claiming her as family without conditions or complications.
"Eduardo," she said carefully, "I need you to know that I'm not here to disrupt your life. I'm not looking for a father figure or trying to insert myself into your family. I needed to know who I was, where I came from." "And now that you know?" Ava considered the question seriously. "I'm still figuring that out, but I feel like I understand myself better already. The environmental work, the rejection of my adoptive family's values, even the way I fell in love with Jackson, it all makes more sense now." Eduardo's eyebrows rose. "Jackson is the young man who came with you?" "My fiancé. He's a middle school science teacher, and he has the same passion for education that you do. Rebecca thinks that's not a coincidence." "I'd like to meet him." "He's waiting at a cafe down the street. I wanted to talk to you alone first, but I'd love for you to meet him." Eduardo closed the photo album and leaned back in his chair, studying Ava's face as if trying to memorize every detail. "I have a confession to make," he said. "When Rebecca called yesterday, after I hung up, I spent hours researching you online. I read about your business, your success, your engagement. I watched interviews you've given, looked at photos from your company events, and I realized that even though I missed your entire childhood, even though I wasn't there to see you grow up, you became exactly the person I would have hoped for. You're intelligent, compassionate,
successful on your own terms. You're making the world better through your work. You found someone who loves you for who you are, not what you can provide for them. Eduardo reached across the table and touched her hand gently. I'm proud of you, Ava, not because you're my daughter, but because of who you've chosen to become. The words hit her like a revelation. Pride. Not disappointment in her choices, not concern about her financial decisions or social status, not attempts to control her future. Just pride in who she was. I want you to meet Jackson, and I want to meet Carmen and Miguel and Sophia, not because I want to complicate your family, but because I want to understand what love looks like when it's not conditional on performance or social status. Eduardo's smile was radiant. I would love that. Carmen is actually excited to meet you. She said any daughter of mine would be welcome in our home. Even though this is complicated? Especially because it's complicated, Eduardo said. Love isn't simple, Ava. Real love, the kind that lasts, is messy and imperfect and full of difficult choices. But it's also the thing that makes everything else worthwhile. As if summoned by their conversation, Ava's phone buzzed with a text from Jackson. How's it going? Ready for me to join you? She showed the message to Eduardo, who laughed. He's protective of you. Very. He's been incredible through all of this. Then let's go meet the man who's going to marry my daughter. They walked together down the tree-lined street toward the cafe where Jackson was waiting, and for the first time since Margaret's devastating announcement 3 days ago, Ava felt like she was moving towards something positive rather than running away from disaster. When they reached the cafe, Jackson was sitting at an outdoor table reading what looked like a Spanish-English dictionary and making notes in a small notebook. He looked up as they approached, and Ava saw his face transform with relief and curiosity. Jackson, she said, I'd like you to meet my father, Eduardo Ramirez. Eduardo extended his hand with a warm smile. Jackson, I've heard wonderful things about you. Thank you for bringing my daughter home to me. As the two men shook hands, Ava realized that this was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not answers to questions about her past, but proof that love could transcend the complications that seemed to define her family relationships. Eduardo accepted her unconditionally, Jackson supported her choices without trying to control them, and even Rebecca had sacrificed her own desires to protect a student who needed her. So, Eduardo said as they all sat down together, tell me about this wedding that was supposed to happen yesterday, because I think it's time we planned a celebration that actually brings families together instead of tearing them apart. Ava looked at Jackson, seeing the same hope reflected in his eyes that she felt blooming in her own chest. They had traveled thousands of miles and weathered devastating revelations to get to this moment, but somehow sitting in a Costa Rican cafe with her biological father and the man she loved, the future finally felt full of possibility instead of uncertainty.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.